how student loans work, the one big beautiful bill, and how that impacts your life if you need to borrow, because it's a whopper. Welcome to the Smart College Buyer Podcast. My mission is to help high school families pay for college without taking on a truckload of debt. Each episode, I'll share insights into college admissions, financial aid, payment strategies, and more, often with expert guests. I'm Jack Wang, your host. I started helping families after struggling to navigate the process myself for my sons. If I needed help, I knew others did too. Let's dive in. Welcome back to this episode of the Smart College Buyer Podcast. My name is Jack Wang. As always, I'm your host. Great to have you with me. And I want to talk about a question that I get really often, which is all about student loans. Like, how much can I borrow? What are the best student loans? How do they work? Things like that. This podcast episode is going to be for the parents of high school students, as well as the parents of college students who are on their way to grad school, right? It could be medical school, law school, or just grad school based on whatever career path they're taking. The new law that just passed recently, signed into law the 4th of July by President Trump, also impacts those who are currently in repayment, so people who have already graduated, but I'll cover that in another episode. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the law was and what the law now is, just so you can get a sense of the difference. So that hopefully this clears up any misconceptions or misinformation you have about student loans, like if you need to borrow, because I get it a lot. I get a lot of people telling me, if my kid wants to go to a more expensive school, they're just going to have to borrow. Well, we'll talk about that. So first and foremost, by virtue of filling out the FAFSA, your undergraduate dependent traditional student can borrow directly from the federal government as an undergraduate. This part did not change. So freshman year, they can borrow $5,500, sophomore year, $6,500, junior year, $7,500, senior year, $7,500, for a total of $27,000. So the stories that you might have seen in the news about I graduated with $400,000 of debt, that doesn't come from this. It came from something else, but it certainly wasn't this. But I want to emphasize that how much your student themselves can borrow, that's it, right? What I just said, that is it. These loans are to the student. There's no credit check because the government understands that they're students. And it's a fixed interest rate. The interest rate is set each year, the summer prior to that academic year. So what that means is after 4 years, you would have 4 loans. Each one of the loans might have a different interest rate, but each one of the interest rates are fixed for the life of that particular loan. There's no payments required during school, though interest does accrue. So if you don't make payments, it does add up. Payments start 6 months after the student leaves school. Notice I did not say graduate. It's 6 months after their final semester there. So back in the old days, right, like when I was in college, kids talk about, I'm going to take a year off and backpack through Europe. Well, yeah, kids still do that. But if you do that, then 6 months after the last semester you were there, payments are going to start. So for the undergraduate borrowing by students, that did not change. And the big, beautiful bill that was passed recently, that did not change these limits. What did substantially change are Parent Plus loans. As I mentioned earlier, your student is done borrowing after those amounts, right? So if you need to borrow more for college and we're counting on Parent Plus loan, that's how families did it because the kids themselves could not borrow anymore. Now, Parent Plus loans work the same way as I just said in terms of the interest rate and the payments and everything else, but the borrower is the parent. It's not a cosigner situation, so the parent's not cosigning for the student, but the borrower is you, the parent. However, the old rules allowed parents to borrow as much as they needed all the way up to the full cost of attendance minus any other aid. So that meant if your son or daughter is going to a college that was $90,000 a year, you could borrow $90,000 a year minus, if they took out their $5,500 or whatever year they were in, minus whatever other aid that your student may have received, but you could do it. And there was basically no credit underwriting. So your credit score did not matter. Your income did not matter. And whether you actually had a job or not did not matter. You could borrow that amount of money. Now, there were some basic, very minor credit underwriting criteria. So, for example, if you had a bankruptcy or foreclosure on your record within the last 7 to 10 years, if you'd ever been subject to a wage garnishment like the last, I think, 5 or 7 years, if you were subject to an IRS tax lien, or if you had other debt, but that other debt was more than $2,000 and it was more than 90 days late. Well, if you met any one of those conditions, you were turned down for a plus loan. But like I said, credit score did not matter. Your income did not matter. Well, the big, beautiful budget bill changed all of that. And that has significant impact for those families who are in high school and needing to borrow. The big, beautiful budget bill now limits Parent Plus loans to $20,000 a year, or $65,000 total per student. Which means that if you borrow the full $20,000 a year, you're done after 3 years. Because of accrued interest, you'd be about $65,000 or more by the time you were going to the 4th year. So you would not be able to borrow that 4th year. That's a significant change. What also changed are the repayment plans. Under the old law, the students themselves on the direct loan had a multitude of income-based repayment options, or the standard option, which was 10 years, which is what everybody starts out on, or an extended option, which goes 25 years, or a graduate option. There was 10 different repayment plans to pick from. And it was very confusing for people because the ability to change repayment plans does not exist anywhere else in our country, right? You can't call up your mortgage company and say, hey, by the way, this month I don't have money, so I'm going to switch repayment plans and send you a lower payment amount, right? You would have to refinance, but if you were in trouble because, let's say, you lost your job, you wouldn't be able to refinance. So the ability to change repayment plans was very unique among student loans, federal student loans. And as a result of its uniqueness, very confusing for people. The new law consolidates all those repayment plans down to 2 options. The standard plan now ranges between 10 and 25 years, depending on your total balance. Or a new type of income-based repayment plan called the Repayment Assistance Plan, or RAP, which takes up to 10% of your discretionary income as a payment. And any loan balance that's not paid off after 30 years would be forgiven. Now, students have access to that, but parents do not. So if you borrowed using the Parent Plus loan starting July 1, 2026, you have access to the standard repayment plan, but those new Parent Plus loans that are, again, limited to $20,000 a year, you would not have access to the Repayment Assistance Plan. Which also means Parent Plus loan borrowers would not be eligible for public service loan forgiveness, one of the most popular loan forgiveness programs out there. So there are some families I've worked with in the past where the parent has worked in the public sector. So we borrowed using Parent Plus loans with the expectation that they would qualify for public service loan forgiveness, but new loans going forward would not be the case. So who does this really impact? Well, it's the families, of course, that are in high school now. So, of course, the alternative that parents would think is, well, if I can't borrow through the Parent Plus loan anymore, I'll borrow using a private student loan, which makes sense. And private student loans are available through a number of banks around the country, credit unions, as well as sort of your quasi-governmental higher education finance authorities of different states. So, for example, in Massachusetts here, we have one called MIFA, Massachusetts Educational Finance Authority, but all different states have something similar. And they may or may not have loan programs. Not every state does. Private loans, you have a lot more options up front, and you can borrow as much as you need subject to underwriting. I'll talk about that in a moment. But you have a lot more options up front. So private loans, you can borrow yourself as the parent, or you can co-sign for your student. Now, all these lenders say, oh, no, we allow students to borrow without a co-signer for undergraduate. Yes, they sort of have to say that because they also have to consider folks like us, right? If I went back for my bachelor's degree, I mean, I have my bachelor's degree, but if I didn't and I went back as a working adult, someone with full employment history, credit history, income history, and I went and borrowed one of these private loans, then yeah, I probably don't need a cosigner. But your 18-year-old traditional undergraduate student, they're going to need a cosigner. That's probably going to be you. But you can choose whether you want to borrow yourself or you want to borrow as a cosigner. You can also pick type of interest rate, fixed interest rate, variable interest rate. Okay, just like mortgages, I guess, or something, and other types of loans we have in our economy. You can also pick the type of payment that you want. So most lenders offer 3 choices. So you can have no payments during school, just like the federal loans and the PLUS loan I talked about. You can have interest-only payments. So kind of like a home equity line of credit, sort of where the payments are just based on the interest based on whatever you borrowed. That could be required during school, or you could be required to make full payments, but you have that choice up front. Now, there are some lenders out there that'll say, okay, we're going to give you a 4th option, and it says you just have to make some dollar amount payment, like $25 a month, $50 a month, or whatever. You know, it might not cover all the interest, but just sort of make that payment, okay? And we're going to require that small amount during school. But again, you have that choice. You can pick that up front. And you can also pick the repayment term. So whether you want to pay it back in 5 years or as long as 20 years, that's entirely up to you. So sounds pretty good, right? But what's the downside? Well, the downside is that private student loans are fully underwritten like mortgages, meaning your credit score does matter. And especially what matters more is your debt to income ratio. Because after all, credit score, you might have an 850 credit score, a phenomenal credit score, but credit score measures whether or not you pay your loans on time, which obviously is important, right? It measures a few other things too. But the biggest factor is whether or not you make on-time payments. But more important than that is something called debt to income ratio. And debt to income ratio tells the lender whether or not you actually have the money to make those payments, right? Because, yeah, you might make all your payments on time, but if you have no money to make them, credit score doesn't really matter in that case. So debt to income ratio measures the amount of your required payments for all your debt divided by your gross monthly income. So for example, like if you have like a mortgage payment, car loan payments, and then the required payments on your credit cards or any other loans that you have divided by your gross monthly income, that is your debt to income ratio. So this calculation does not count any extra payments that you might make. So for example, like if you send in an extra $100 a month on your mortgage payment, it doesn't count that. But a good ratio by typical financial standards would be about like 30%. So that means if you make $10,000 a month, now remember this is gross income before all your deductions, before 401k, before health insurance, before taxes are taken out. So if your payments are, let's say, $3,000 a month divided by $10,000 a month gross payment, that's 30%. So a good rule of thumb is about 30%, 35% is a good sort of safe number, right? It allows you the ability to make your payments, but you still have plenty of money left over to actually live day to day. Now, if you're a mortgage broker or you know a mortgage broker or something, they might tell you, oh no, that's too low because there are mortgage programs that allow you to go to 45, 50, whatever percent of your income. Yeah, that's true. Those mortgage programs do allow those, but you are in serious danger territory unless you anticipate your income growing very rapidly in the near future, or you get like significant bonuses, or you're going to expect some sort of windfall or something. So you think about that. Okay, so what's the big deal? Well, this is now a huge deal, right? So what the big budget bill has effectively done is now if you need to borrow, you now need to pay a lot more attention to the rest of your finances. So if you already have kind of a high debt to income ratio because you have a big mortgage or you have a couple car loans or whatever the case may be, you might not be able to borrow for college. Like you might have a phenomenal credit score, but you might not have enough income capacity to borrow anymore. So you now have to pay attention to this other stuff. In particular, if you're the parent of a high school student, like especially if you have a rising senior, rising junior, I don't want to say you're in real trouble, but you got to really pay attention to this now if you were intending to borrow to be able to send your kid to college. Because in an extreme situation, if your kid gets into a school that's $90,000 a year, and assuming she doesn't get other aid, there's probably isn't enough time for you to save $90,000 a year to pay tuition, right? If you weren't able to borrow. Because after all, if you were able to save $90,000 a year, then you wouldn't have to worry about any of this, right? Just you have the cash, why borrow? Now, if you're debt to income ratioed out or you're ratioed out or incomed out, I guess is what you call it, you have a couple of choices. One is obviously you can go get more income, right? So you can go ask your boss for a raise, easier said than done, but you can. Or you have to pick up like a second job or a side gig or whatever, right? So you can raise your income. Or you're going to need to lower the amount of debt. And in particular, you have to get rid of the payments, right? So let's say you have some money laying around and you could pay off one of the credit cards or a car loan or something completely, so it gets rid of the payment. That helps also because that reduces the amount of payment in that debt to income ratio calculation. But if you have a bunch of money laying around and you, let's say, just pay down your mortgage, right? So you make a huge payment on your mortgage, your balance comes way down, but you don't get rid of your mortgage, that does not change your monthly payment. So that does not impact your debt to income ratio. It doesn't help. Okay, so now you have to be kind of strategic. If you're going to pay down debt, you got to really think about what debt to pay down, because the whole name of the game here is cash flow payments, not the rate, not whatever. So you got to now start thinking about this. Okay, that's for undergraduate. You have to also make similar decisions if you are the parent of a current college student who's going to go off to graduate school, because those rules have substantially changed. Now, in the past, your student going off to grad school will be considered independent for financial aid purposes, and so they could borrow all the money they needed themselves to pay for graduate school. And they did it using what's called a direct loan, which gave them an annual limit of $20,500. Now, that part actually did not change. But then if they need to borrow more than $20,500, they could use something called a Grad Plus loan, which allowed them to borrow all the way up to the cost of attendance, just kind of like a Parent Plus loan, like we talked about earlier, but this is for graduate school. The difference being, of course, the Parent Plus loans for undergraduate, and parents, you are the borrower. Grad Plus, that's for grad school, but the student themselves are still the borrower, not you. But you were able to do that. Well, under the new law, Grad Plus goes away completely starting July 1, 2026. That means that your student going off to grad school is not going to be able to borrow a lot of money. Now, it creates two levels. For professional school meaning medical, dental, vet, law, your student would be able to borrow $50,000 a year up to a total cap of $200,000 per year. So 4 years effectively. If they're going to other types of graduate school, not professional, then they're limited to the $20,000 a year with a cap of $100,000. So a lot less. Now, this has implications for you as the parent. If your kid was going to go off to medical school or dental school or whatever, and was counting on borrowing, you were counting on your kid to be able to borrow, right, to pay for that school, because you as the parent, maybe you didn't want to help them pay for graduate school, or maybe you didn't have the ability to help them, right, because you got your own bills to worry about. They now have a problem, right, because there are a lot of medical schools, dental schools out there that cost more than the annual loan limit, and they go a lot longer than what you're going to be able to borrow for. So now if your kid wants to go to grad school, it might come back on you as parents to co-sign for private loans. And now you have all the same issues we just talked about if you're co-signing for private loans for undergraduate. So it's a big, big deal. It's a big, beautiful bill. I don't know how beautiful it is, but it's a big deal. But it's also a big deal for you as the parent, because now your finances are going to be a lot more important to your kid going to college and or grad school. What can you do about this? Well, we talked a little bit about the debt to income ratio, right? You can go get a second job or a side gig or refinance your mortgage to lower the monthly payment or pay down loans. In fact, I'll just talk briefly about refinancing your mortgage. You might have one of those mortgages where you took out several years ago, so your mortgage is like a 3% interest rate, and that is awesome. But you may need to refinance that and stretch the payments back out to 30 years, even though your interest rate might shoot up to 6 or so. I don't really know what the mortgage interest rates are right now. I know they're higher than 3. I don't know how high they are. But your interest rate probably will be higher, but the act of stretching it back out to 30 years, if that lowers your monthly payment, that's going to help that debt to income ratio. So it's really not about the rate. The other thing that you and your student may have to do is really look at the types of schools you're applying to. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't apply to whatever school because you might get a lot of aid. But now the cost after aid, or what we call net price, becomes really important. And you have to take really realistic looks at your likelihood for getting aid. Because if you are looking at a school that's $90,000 a year, but you know realistically you're not going to get aid for whatever reason, but you don't have the savings to pay $90,000 a year, and now you might not have the ability to borrow $90,000 a year, that school can't be on the list, right? There's no way it's going to happen, okay? The money just isn't there. So now you're going to have to really think about, okay, do I really want to let my kid apply that school, or should we look at some other lower price options? And that doesn't necessarily mean public schools, right? A lot of people think automatically, well, my kid's not going to go to private, they'll go to public. No, there's plenty of good, great private schools out there that are very generous with aid, that bring the cost down to close to public, or in some cases even below. So the financial side just got a lot more important, than it did as of, July 1st or whatever, before, President Trump signed the law on July 4th, but the bill was percolating before then. The other thing, what I've had some parents also say to me, well, I guess my kid's just going to have to apply for a bunch of scholarships. And yes, that is one of those things that is theoretically possible, although in practice, it is very impractical. Should your kids be applying for outside, or what we call external scholarships? Yeah, I think so. I think it's good. But if you needed to apply to cover $90,000 a year, and I'm using $90,000 a year because that's the extreme case. Okay, but if your kid need to apply to get enough in scholarships to cover a $90,000 a year bill, they have to apply to a lot of scholarships. I mean, a lot of scholarships to hopefully net $90,000, because after all, they're not going to get every scholarship that they apply for, right? Other kids will get some of them. So we're talking a lot of money here. These are things that, as a parent, you need to start thinking about right now, especially if you have a rising senior or a rising junior, because there just isn't a lot of time to make significant changes in your finances, unless you want to like refinance your mortgage or whatever, then maybe. But there just isn't a lot of time to make a lot of huge changes. So the planning, the strategies become ultra important here. And the sooner you start thinking about it, the better off you're going to be. As always, please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Smart College Buyer podcast. I hope you found something useful for your family's journey. Follow me on social media for more episodes, videos, and tips. The links are in the show notes below. Remember, you can spend time now to plan and strategize, or you can spend more money later. Success in college admissions and financial aid isn't about luck. It's about being intentional. And I'm here to help you every step of the way.